Alright, well, looks like it's time for the big one, the big boy. My favorite albums of the past decade. Notice how I said favorite and not best or most culturally relevant. These are just the records that I've spent the most time with and grown the most attached to over the past decade, but I would be really surprised if this list didn't change in the future, so don't take it too seriously. At number 50, we've got Shaking the Habitual by The Knife. This record has such a showy, fuck-all energy. It's like a peacock flaunting its feathers in a jungle, or complete uproar inside a royal estate, with china being thrown to the walls, and the instruments beat you up so full throttle, they start to sweat and slip about in the ferment, and they pelt down with such weight they're like enamel-coated balls falling from the 10th story of the place, or heels smacking the marble floors. And the ambiance sounds like it straight up dumps acid into it, adding to the rage and momentum, and it's anything but a fantasy. It's this story of power and corruption, and Karen's vocals sound like they've been paranormally possessed, or this whole thing involves a bloodline of mutated freaks of nature. Next up, we've got Remember Us to Life by Regina Spektor. The piano performances on this record are like dramatic, sensational seesaws, and the strings are so climactic. They single-handedly transform tracks into Broadway numbers. And Regina's vocals juggle a strong physique and petiteness in the same way a figure skater would, just effortlessly. And I feel like if you touched them, they would billow out like a cloth made of satin, but she still takes the time to press down notes with conviction where appropriate. It's like she could go from 0 to 100 as easily as you could squish a marshmallow or foam and then let go. Plus, her brain must just have a million imaginative symbols and anecdotes stored inside. Her writing shows she has a heart of gold and a scissor-sharp intellect. Like with Sellers of Flowers, she had to have taken her brain through such a labyrinth to arrive at a metaphor that niche, yet it perfectly communicates her point about all the industries in the world that blatantly make no sense but continue to thrive because no one questions them. Then there are the think pieces on growing pains and confronting that feeling of being outside the crowd as a kid that's slow burned inside of you for years, like on Bleeding Heart and Tornadoland. Then it has moments it just lets a few tonal images prick the senses, like the light. It's really like a banquet table where each platter serves a different part of her finesse. Next up, we've got A Moon-Shaped Pool by Radiohead. This record is full of lazy rivers and lagoons, and as you coast through them, instruments tickle your skin like they're pebbles or shells from the seashore, or it's like you're in the center of a fountain and they're drizzling on top of you. But while most of what's attractive about the record is its arrangement, since its finish is pretty strictly glaze, it's not completely free of timbre either. Here and there it'll sound like a phantom is just passing through it, and present tense and true love waits and daydreaming all sound like they exist in the dreary air beside hospital daybeds where the only light that comes through is through the cracks of curtained windows. But occasionally tracks do defy the passiveness, like Identikit and Burn the Witch soar with grander ambition, and Full Stop is a separate beast entirely. It actually tests your sanity by using these instruments that are wriggly as intestines, then placing this murmuring bass line over top that repeatedly squeezes then releases them. The track almost feels claustrophobic, like being trapped in a glass box filled with flies or crawling snakes. But even though the rest of the record doesn't have that extreme a personality, you have to just let it pull you into sedative indifference, and it can really unclog all the thoughts in your head with simple rinses. Next up, we've got Cerulean by Baths. This is an adorably gushy little package of tracks. The melodies are like sponges. You could squeeze them and so much unadulterated passion would fall out. And Will communicates the same. He stretches his voice out to all of its natural squeaks and cracks on You're My Excuse to Travel. He gets carried away and doesn't care. The record's like all of these flakes of sound falling into every crevice of your body and making it tingle in the same way that it would if you were falling stupidly in love. The production has the consistency of aerated froth, plus the percussion rattles and frolics about and knocks it up. Then you have sidechain, which is like a plunger sucking it all in every so often. ritzy gold acoustics cut and slink through it on plea, whereas sometimes they're just worked in as a delicate embellishment and gingerly surface out of what's become such a dense sound garden. Then you have the ambiance, which is powdery, it's like all the pollination inside of it, or it's like all the condensation inside a steamy shower, but Hall and rafting starlit Everglades arrange it into surges, so it feels like surfing along tides in some sort of islandy paradise. And it leaves off on this note that feels like something blocking your ability to be with this person. Like Will sounds like he's singing from the other side of a wall, but still proclaims that he'll let these feelings exist, weightless in space forever. Next up, we've got The Impossible Kid by Aesop Rock. Parts of this record's production sound epic as the final level of a video game. The crystal clear synthesizers move as erratically as a laser light show, and then you have the slippery swag of record turntablism. Sometimes it has supernatural qualities as well, like it sounds like a cartoon ghost is flying through Supercell, and that's meant to represent the way that he can fall into hermit-like routines for his craft. But the record also shows the side of him that doesn't push his limits. Like on Dorks, he even admits that the type of person killing himself over something like this is blind to so much and can't teach society anything. And Get Out of the Car is this barefaced reality check where he acknowledges that there's a lot of trauma clogged up in his system and he should probably be more patient with himself as he digests it. And based on how idiosyncratic some of the other song topics are, you can tell that even when he goes about more of a conventional routine, he feels totally safe in his misfit skin and just puts everything out into the open, which is my favorite shit in the world. But he's still like this indecisive shadow with a million contradicting perceptions of the matter. He might say all this, then recede to his soggy-ass bedroom for days on end. Like Shrunk has this moment where his therapist tries to tell him this shit's unhealthy, but he symbolically spits abstract gibberish back at her that translates to "fuck off, I know what I'm doing." And Molecules is this heated promise to show the way his brain's wired until his days run out. I can just picture him back to the floor, microphone to his lips, belting out that hook in some sort of offering. And on Supercell, he tries to convince himself that avoiding his family over the holidays is a woke decision because he can spend that time remodeling the pixels in his world to art. And of course, he's in his usual form here, hyperactively playing with linguistic possibilities like he's in a big-ass jungle gym, coming up with these fearlessly excessive mouthfuls where the gobs of words just fall out of him like a stream of slobber or drool. And one unbeatable quality of his style in general, but especially this record, is how you could look at individual bars or song topics or existential points and see one track in a million new ways, but everything still reinforces itself. It's incredible. I just want to get tea with this guy so bad. Next up, we've got Dissociation by the Dillinger Escape Plan. This album essentially simulates your neurons losing control. It spasmodically hurtles from one thing into the next. And even though tracks are crammed with riffs of different tones and amounts of strain, they unite to common goal like weeds overpopulating a brick wall. And if the guitars start to hit the same chord in a straight line, it sounds like an emotional malfunction, a corrupt file. Sometimes a melodic moment reveals itself from underneath the track, like it's been waiting on its basement floor. And considering the electronic touches, I imagine everything together looks like these multicolored blazes in a gas fireplace. And the songwriting exists in the contamination that a failed relationship left, rather than actively reckoning with keeping it around, and it's framed like a demon crawled into the narrator's bed at night and possessed him without invitation, and his memories are glitched to endlessly repeat in this trance inside his head. He sees none of his actual life. Most of the time the vocals sound totally gruff and grisly, like they're coming from gremlins as they're being choked, but they can also get sensual and indulged in revenge, and that's part of what makes stomaching this record so hard. It responds to the situation with spite, and it's unconcerned with forgetting, until the two send-off moments where it is like the narrator's genuinely trying to move forward with grace and dignity, but can't work out how. And the thin, sour chips that surround the closer sound like all of the feeling dispersing into space and stripping him to the bone. And his slow, steady vocal performances are him trying to push the feeling through his guts, which knock me flat after the record's constant tossing and turning. But that's how the rest of it stays, just tangling your insides into clots and tumors. Next up, we've got The Idler Wheel by Fiona Apple, who uses pretty matter-of-fact terminology on this thing, but has the most lovable sardonic tongue and the most visceral imagery in the game. And on top of that, when she talks about relationships, she always manages to strike such an exact chord with me about them becoming this routine, where she brashly throws herself at people, then wants them less the better she knows them, or sees herself becoming totally perverse and short-fused in dealing with their issues. And she does delegitimize her internal temper tantrums, but she knows they're ingrained, like it's genuinely just needing someone else to tell you how the hell to fix it and supervise your love life. And her growling vocals have such a thespian intensity and irritability, it's like they dump vinegar into the production, which is really just bare frames, but the bass keys have enough weight to feel like rocks falling on your back, and the percussion is either live and has this wide flop, or it's handcrafted with more of a rusted scrape, and they're so ASMR close that when their rhythms simulate something clunky as a rotary, like on Jonathan and Regret, it really digs into your insides. And by the end of all that stampeding emotion, it's perfect close things out with a demented chant where all she can process is sex and sensation. Next up, we've got Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar. The lyricism on this record is essentially like he just plopped down a big-ass keepsake box or photo album from his teenage years, and in the youngest pictures he had this wide-eyed gaze onto a lifestyle that was far more lethal than he could see, but the scope of these things would open up for him like a retractable camera lens. And you can easily see this by comparing what's at stake in the art of peer pressure to Mad City, and then his eventual spiral to Sing About Me, where the stench of death surrounded his air and base level survival became his only prayer. This track feels about as desperate to heal this cutthroat world as it is to put roses on the grave of a deceased loved one, and the record's production gives many of its stories muscle, whether that's in the fleshy low ends or enhancements like the chain slaps through backseat freestyle, which help it scream blind materialism, and swimming pools and Real talk about how easy it is to end up with no sense of identity outside of drug culture, and in a way, the record is like this acknowledgement that gang violence happens through similar mass falling into line. But if the drums are meaty, then the pianos and vocal melodies are like the cheese melting into them, or sometimes layers that are even wispier are placed on top, giving it this weirdly satisfying division of weight, like on Money Trees, where it sounds like the production's just blowing this piece of lint over a firmer cushion, like maybe an exercise pillow or something. And then Bitch Don't Kill My Vibes guitars make it sound like it exists in a milky dream state, and Kendrick suggests that this is where music takes him, and that's why he'll always be so diligent with his technique. And since he's surrounded by a much wider demographic now, it's that much clearer how heavy his upbringing was, and why any chance to reminisce on the positives of his childhood is precious. So it's pretty moving on Compton when he's able to represent his hometown in context of being crowned king for his accomplishments. And this beat slams down grand pianos in total rupture, and of course the posh mastering quality to the whole project makes it sound like it was sent off in $1 million frame, and he even works with Dre on this track, making it that much more convincing that this is a point in his career that's worth getting sappy over. Next up, we've got Black Messiah by D'Angelo. This record sounds as stomach-settling as hot cocoa. It sounds like floating to the clouds in the embrace of some ancestor worship. The low ends don't have much of a tugging weight, but 1000 Deaths is the one exception to that rule. Its bass uses these crushed whirs that sound like clumps of sugar flying up, then it adds in loose plucks over that leave splinters in your skin. Most of the tracks sound like the flecks of dust on an old funk record being rearranged into something stranger and heartier. There's slack to these instrumentals, but they're also layered enough to seem filled out and fatty, and even spontaneous, like they sound like they could be recorded off the cuff from the center of a circle of musicians. And they're half hymns and half provocative love songs, like the classical guitar on Really Love gives the track a sensual Spanish kiss, for example, but all of them sound like they could be played inside a black and white Polaroid as two people share a cigarette after sex. And the social messages are idealistic bliss. They suggest that peaceful protest will save and there will be everlasting triumphance in the face of racial discrimination. Dope record. Next up, we've got the Shoo Shoo rendition of the Twin Peaks soundtrack, which I've heard the original soundtrack, but I've not actually seen this TV show, just so we're clear that like any images I'm coming up with are just from the sound alone. But yeah, the original is this dark jazz ambient crossover that has a spellbinding lure. It sounds like a hike through a mountain trail at night, and there's definitely a subtle notion of paranormal activity to it, like an empty, haunted mansion full of cobweb-covered furniture and shattered mirrors, maybe a fallen chandelier. The Shoo Shoo added enhancements mash soiled wreckage into everything. Sometimes they just evoke that feeling of laying in a sewer, and that's it. Other times they're far more torturous, and the noise guitars stab like teethed pitchforks, which Jamie's discombobulated vibrato fits next to perfectly, along with any bits that feel electronically pixelated. There are these plodding rhythms, and whether they just sound like simple gears rotating or straight bulldozers through the track, they feel like a forewarning that soon you'll have to pay for your sins or being forced to dig your own grave, and you can hear your heart throbbing loud as ever. I think Packard's vibration is one of those. It sounds like the ceiling of a building could just fall on your head and kill you instantly at any moment. And I think, albeit simple, Harold's theme is kind of a quiet stunner in the track list. It's primarily centered around these two layers that follow the same arrangement, and one of them is this instrument that's yanked totally unnaturally to liquefy and fill out the space and sends it into a blurry black hole. But then the pianos on top seem simple enough to still be on Earth, just probably in some dead zone filled with scarecrows and burned fields. Next up, we've got Space's Only Noise by Nicholas Jarre. This project loops around these opening and closing samples of kids playing and a lake swash, so right off the bat you feel like you're in a campground or park at like 8 p.m. as it's starting to dim into night. Or it also kind of sounds like walking through a suburb in the fall right as the school year is starting, with all of these crinkled up, tattered leaves and bonfire smoke blowing through the air. On the whole, the record seems to cluster together morsels and pebbles from various terrains on Earth and has them interact with a snap, crackle, pop, or lets water trickle through their gaps. And the tracks have a sinister tiptoe to suggest that all of the world is just a senseless, choreographed ballet. And the pianos have a diamond luster. They're chirpy and airy, but other times they're as droopy as the vocal deliveries, which makes you feel like you're seeing it all through groggy eyes or with a damp rag on your forehead. But it actually gets terror-stricken and astringent in a few moments, like in Sunflower's pianos, which sound like they're tumbling into catastrophe, or nosedives down little roller coasters. And the strings towards the end of Too Many Kids Finding Rain in the Dust have like a Latin flavored whine. But there's one moment that just ascends freely, like projectiles jetting over a blank light gray sky, and that's Balancer Between Your Eyes. The vocals secrete all over this track like they just thawed out of all the ice crystals kind of hanging out in the background, and its alternating plucks sound like a flag blowing in the wind at sea. The record is noticing all of the humdrum areas of the functioning world for as animate and poetic as they are in nature. Next up, we've got Returnal by Oneohtrix Point Never. This record sounds like wandering through a bunch of obscure areas at night and finding whole populations of beasts and fairies and lonely seamen. That last case is most prominent in describing bodies, which has this celestial ease to it that ships signal out for help or comfort or just some sort of communication through, and Ouroboros sounds more distant. It uses this organ to sound like the ending of an old film where the sun rises over the shore, but absolutely nothing is solved. And this record has an incredibly fluid progression. Like, the closer sounds like it's sourced out of decay, maybe from like a boat creaking and breaking and filling up with water from below, which bubbles as it rises. But then the opener just punts you straight back in, uses these jagged edge fences and squeezes your sides and dumps them on you and lets them pile up, but then describing bodies is an immediate lift out of that. Then the next track, Stress Waves, is the first time that anything pokes the stillness. The layers lag for a bit before reacting and then billowing out like a dress skirt. And then the next track has much more of a presence. It sounds like bouncy box springs, and the vocals are so grotesque, they sound like a brute that's grown out of it. And then it carries forward with these one-note, swampy sound beds that buzz like pixies and bugs in Twilight. Next up is To Be Kind by Swans. This record in one sitting is like a claustrophobic headache. It's totally impenetrable. It jerks you up, down, then leaves you to soak in the swirling vomit that it induces. The vocals and bass lines show their ugly teeth. On She Loves Us and Oxygen, they're like chunks of dirt being grinded against each other as remnants fly up. And on A Little God in My Hands, it sounds like a massive screw twisting, while the acoustics prowl and slink about like a panther. They add the perfect kiss of doom in the same way that the pianos do to Screenshot. And yeah, even though most of the time the instrumentation is all just barbarically trying to ram itself through a trapdoor, there are points it does react to being overdriven and just completely sink, like you just fell off a cliff and your anatomy is withering into pieces before you hit the ground. This is most potent to me in the middle section of Bring the Sun, and depending on what part of this track you focus on, you could see it as growing into a supermassive celestial body or the ground opening up into a hole. And plus the clinking bells and horse gallops make it sound like it's part of some medieval chivalry. My best guess on the concept of this record is that if the universe were to be kind, you would be held in the womb forever, or in some sort of half-consciousness that only a religious cult could grant you, while they just feed your blood to some greater corruption. Next up, we've got Bottomless Pit by Death Grips. It is just such a strange dynamic to feel simultaneously revolted and high on a sugar rush. But this record's production sounds putrid and squeamish as fragmented body parts. It's balls to the wall like sloshing drain water, and then when that rambunctious energy is combined with fluorescent synthetics, it sounds like a game of laser tag. Sometimes the electronics sound like they were sourced out of malware or corrupt bytes on a computer and then just stretched in all of these unnatural ways, or thrown onto the stove and made to fizz. And then some of the tracks that could be classified as noise rock technically, like the title track and Giving Bad People Good Ideas, kind of sound like a leaf blower directly under your face. And the actual personality behind this record reminds me of that of like a regular Reddit or 4chan user, but like one that's empowered by the fact that their mind is such an obscene rabbit hole. I don't know, man. It just makes me feel like I'm wearing cool kid sunglasses, charges me up. It makes me want to go work out, and I've never worked out a day in my life, so we stand this one. Next up is You Won't Get What You Want by Daughters. This record takes blistering insanity from a vacuum cleaner or a blender of sirens and casts it into structured sculptures, and a lot of that is thanks to repetition. It feels like how you would react if your body was about to be thrown into a furnace or put on an electric chair. It's that high a degree of delirium, and the sentiments behind it are wretched and suffocating. It's this middle-aged realization that nothing ever gets better, and actually each stage of your life gets worse and proves that to you more plainly. And I'm genuinely terrified that I'm headed towards this, so it messes me up trying to stomach it. The instrumentation just sounds like choking on your own hyperventilation. The only time it actually exhales is in the subterranean desert slither of Daughter and Less Sex. And that track I interpret as a point you get so despondent you even start to avoid the innate carnal satisfactions of being human and let that in itself arouse you. It's totally demented, its eyes roll to the back of its head. And I suppose City Song is kind of an oddball of the bunch. It sets up this whole terrain of rising froth and gunpowder and shots ring out through it. And the bass on The Flammable Man has a similar texture but rougher. It's like that of hot coal. And on Satan and the Weight, it gnashes into you like you're on train tracks. The record's really all about disobeying against the miserable trial that is being alive by losing your shit. Next up, we've got Loud City Song by Julia Holter. I love how in the first track of this record, most of the instrumentation stays suspended. It just kind of spritzes and teases you, because then once the first leg of Maxim's 1 hits, it's this exquisite monsoon. And this is one of those tracks that has a fairly blobby arrangement on the record, while others kick instrumental cycles over top of everything. Horns Surrounding Me and In the Green Wild, for example. And that track has an earthly bass line that just shovels into its soil, which I fucking love. The whole record kind of sounds like it's encompassed in nebulous vapor, like on the rings of Saturn, but with the same even moisture you would find in Morning Dew, and Hello Stranger just totally drowns in that baggy formlessness. But Julia's vocals are soft as dove feathers and pastel as a coat of blush, while when she gets indulged in the mysteria, they get snippier, like cotton balls dabbing your face, and her writing captures the essence of a walk through all of these environments, like sailboat harbors and bridges and city streets and parks. And she uses the time to muse on life and laugh at its absurdity from the outskirts of everything, but this addiction to solitude affects her relationships too, like City Appearing and He's Running Through My Eyes and In the Green Wild all sound like she's closing herself off to everything but ephemeral havoc, just the type that opens up this flashing multicolor high that feels like all time at once, then just folds back into abrupt halt. Next up, we've got Nymphs by Nicholas Jar. None of the sound design on this thing feels remotely synthetic. It's like Nicholas just spread out a bunch of raw materials he'd been stockpiling through an alleyway and just started battering them all, really going ham. And that bleak, polluted cold is balanced by his balmy, woozy vocals that sound like a swirling sunset or melted rainbow sherbet. And he works with so many different textures on this thing and has them bustle and get so antsy. There are points they sound like crinkling paper or rustling sheets or sparks popping in a fire. And their surface looks pointy as a porcupine, but it's splotchy and free flows from one thing to the next in a soup. And of course, percussive slabs are thrust beneath it. They have a wide timbre like they're aluminum barrels being dented by baseball bats. Hearing them definitely triggers the funny bone. All the null, stretchy synth work at the forefront of the production dampens it into a tired numbness. It sounds like that lingering dissatisfaction that never quite leaves your system, no matter where you end up. And Three Sides of Audrey opens with these reversed, swishing drones that sound disorienting as that first moment your eyelids peek open after some chaotic mess of a night, or a lucid dream, or being evaporated into a swarm of flies. But there's an anguish to it as well, like watching your life slip between your fingers as sand. Next up is Sun Coming Down by Ott. This record is a product of the hopeless purgatory of our 9-to-5s, and Darcy speaks of it like a total misanthrope would, just uncut and resentful, and his vocal tone sardonically teases as if he's entertaining the role of the superficial businessman, or just laughing at the fact that that's exactly who he's become. And his vocals are nestled just underneath the instrumentation in the mix, which is the most frank way to mimic that frustration that I can think of, and an idea that sells how pragmatic and bullheaded his brain is even more. And he hollers up to guitars that either sound like thorns being put through an unnatural amount of pressure and braided together like on Beautiful Blue Sky, or that are more scorched and caked in coal, whether they're strained or more patient plows like the title track, or Passionate Turn, which winds lethargically out of these gnarls and contortions, but regardless, they burn and bruise your skin and still reek of whatever kerosene set them into flames. And I'll forever think that Beautiful Blue Sky is the pinnacle of this record, just everything brought to its fullest potential. It starts from a blank instrumental plane, then stomps down these sterile-ass phrases you probably hear from acquaintances every day, as a smiling reminder that none of this was meant to be fulfilling. But the more you understand that, the less afraid you are to soak in it and just make a total idiot of yourself at clubs, and even to see the natural world more graphically. But it's not liberating, it's devastating. Next up, we've got The Archandroid by Janelle Monae. This record uses all of these ornamental sections. I'm talking string-centered overtures, caroling vocals. Sir Greendown is a ballroom waltz. Then there are instrumentals where everything's given equal weight in a single prickly brew that just prances heavenward like Faster. The production's ritzy, it's like being baptized in glitter and gold, but it also has the vigor of Fruit Punch. Like, these hooks are nonchalantly dynamic as fuck. The guitars and Janelle's vocal projection just shock it like high voltage electricity, while sometimes she has this angelic sachet, and other times she has this nasally, nerdy clunk like on Mushrooms and Roses and Wonderland, which totally plays into the whole vision for this record being about a kingdom of droids that simultaneously captures the essence of medieval folklore, and its instrumental palette is about as fertile and plentiful as the valleys that it's set in. It's voluminous, each track is like a page of the novel, and one inspired by blackness, and how Janelle grew used to white America labeling these features as defects and is flipping them into part of her sparkle. And it's getting rightfully heated over oppression while also fighting for the chance to heal and for her fantasy of authentic yet sensational love. And everything's pulled off so scrupulously, fearlessly, and with an expensive-ass display case as a kind of rebellion. It's to the point there's no way you could deny its spunk. Next up, we've got Black Up by Shabazz Palaces. The instruments on this record sound like puffs into a vast area, like say a fog-covered soccer field at 4 a.m., or fuck it, some unfathomably extensive nothingness like outer space. It sounds like cosmic matter being peppered throughout galaxies, or at least the clustered arrangement of Eulogy screams that. The sound design's littered with static that crumbles and fizzes and sprays. Sometimes elements are bluntly stacked, sometimes they're consolidated into warbling waves, sometimes they're tinkered with to become straight, freakish erotica, like the snazzy swivels on The Closer, or the feral, dilating vocal samples on An Echo. And the brass and stark drums on Endeavors for Never are like an elegant treasure chest in a desert, a potent taste of culture amidst all these fabricated synthetics. But it mostly maintains that sleek varnish, and Butler slides over it so suavely. The guy's a truth-seeking poet chasing some vague, unattainable sensation of flying with headstrong will within his art, or just his mind, consciousness itself. His destiny might still be confinement in the working class and in systemic racism, but this stands as his one vessel to defiantly esteem and put power into the hands of the underdogs in society and in the music industry. Next up, we've got Virgins by Tim Hecker. This record's sound play barely holds its ends together. Like Virginal and Live Room use these detuned, lagging piano blocks that patter brutally as rain on a windowsill, and when these already brain-bending landscapes are zapped by an outside force, it leaves that much more serious a wound. Like Stigmata 2 uses this shy, rhythmic heartbeat to lure you into spaciness, just to attack you by etching in these tears that penetrate deeply into the blood, or like Live Room becoming a disheveled crackle after noise is shoved in, and then shriveling away into an ambient pool and aftershock. It's a tried and true Tim Hecker technique that feels that much more tragic in context of how much affliction led it there. And you can sense its cremated remains withering out into the stratosphere in Live Room Out, which really feels like its last-ditch mourning statement. But the record's not exclusively stubs and rubble. The other half of the sound evens things out in what's essentially its antithesis, a level, passive luster. Tracks like Radiance and Incense are coded in it, and their high-octave squeals sound like astringent woodwinds. It feels like a hint of the soft-hued dawn, the heavens cleansing and awakening you, then tossing you back into ruin. Another one of those tracks is the opener, which does flicker on and off in hesitation, but it flashes in all of these bizarre angles and has a blinding glare as if you're looking straight at the sun. It sounds like it's casting spells, and you have to wonder if that's been its source of disruption the whole time, if it was bewitched. Next up, we've got Forget by Shushu. This record matches accounts of sex trafficking with about as much sonic disgust as body parts being dragged against concrete, or your body temperature when you have the flu, or the perspiration on your skin and saliva in your mouth before throwing up. Jamie Stewart's vibrato wriggles into your ear like a spider, and it sounds like industrial cables are being pulled beneath the production. The low ends burble like boat motors, and the melodies sound like they're a part of a game of paintball, but like one being played with toxic fuel. And the glamour that it achieves amidst all this is beyond my ears' comprehension, but somehow it lands on these confectionery grooves too. There are spaces on Get Up and Hey Choco Bananas that sound like being suspended by a stun gun, and the form performer is expertly paced. It starts absorbed in all of this negative space other than a modest guitar curling inward and outward, and the longer it draws on, the less you expect significant crescendo. So when a single scream in the last leg triggers total blowout, it's fucking unbearable. And the title track uses a similar technique. Its hook is guided by all of these nosedives that make your stomach drop. Then it eventually stair-steps back up by penetrating these cold discs through your flesh. And both are actually sandwiched together to sensory overload at the end. And the last image that this record leaves you with is a flipbook of fallen souls. It's the finishing touch on this degrading nightmare, which does a pretty sufficient job at instilling that your role from your first breath was meat to sex traffickers. Next up, we've got Skeleton Tree by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. This is true for any record that I talk about, but especially in this case, I just want to make it totally clear that all of this is just based on how my brain responds to the imagery. I don't want to act like I'm speaking in place of Nick Cave or anything like that. The need to process pain after tragedy creates intricate worlds that mostly live and die within people. They're just kind of crammed in there until they rot and decompose. So when they're actually released in accounts as graphic as this, it becomes that much more consequential in my eyes. And this record feels a lot like the colossal stillness after you get back from the hospital in the middle of the night, before any feelings able to properly enter your system, and just sits there unaddressed like a rock in your stomach that wants to come out as vomit. It's your inanimate surroundings, like the walls and the furniture, taunting you just for standing so steadily when fundamentally everything within you is about to leave. It's the blood in your eyes and the screaming in your ears and the white noise ringing around this brutal world. And as more time passes, you do start to free fall straight and maybe subconsciously think that with everyone and everything still out there, there has to be something to grab onto midair, but it all just dips out because none of it has any influence on the situation. The record is a blinking no-signal default on your TV that reflects back onto your face in a dark room as you stare blankly. It's becoming cordial with the fact that the universe is impersonal. It has nothing to give back to you. It has no explanation or reason. And the lyrics deal in subjects that are removed or skewed, but lifelike. They're illusory. They're your brain being cast off its trajectory completely and starting to book it forward into the neighboring areas in confusion. And the instrumentals make you feel like just a body in a contained tunnel or slumping under the sea and being left naked, wet, and shivering. The synthetics are clear, but have a range of consistencies like a mess of secretions from a hot glue gun, and the ambiance is like fans or ventilators with spit in their path, spurting onto you, peeling off the layers of you, and leaving you nothing but a fleshy, shabby core, and all you can do is clutch it by yourself under a blanket. But this means that once you're equipped to reckon with recovery, you're that much more aware of how valuable it is, and it feels like this full-body lift. Skeleton Tree, Distant Sky, and I Need You all kind of feel like this point to me. Their rising, lucent melodies dilute your bloody torment into the glare of the sun. Next up, we've got Birth of a New Day by 2814. This record's glossy pearls are hot pressed down with its drones, and then it's all smeared and spun into these wormholes that just dissolve all your other surroundings. It seems tender on first impression, but it really lures you into an unhealthily exaggerated state of mind. It preys after all of the emotion in the world like a dog, then feeds it back through your veins in technicolor. Its sirens bleed and cry out for loss and for gain, and the same amount of steam you would expect to find in a sauna rises out of the percussion as it wades through it, but in context of everything else, it feels much more polluting. It's like being asphyxiated in CO2. And I don't know about anyone else, but to me this record is really like a vision of lying on top of snow alone in a village outside Tokyo, aching because you're so honestly, desperately in love with this delirious life, and the glow of the lights downtown reflect in your mind, but at the same time you're cognizant that there's so much toxicity to all that industry, and the sound beds carry enough gravity to feel like the countdown to some fateful reset, whether that means apocalypse or some new absurdity beyond our grasp of comprehension. The world is about to crash like a shattered mosaic. Next up is Process by Sampha, whose vocals have such pungent soul and sensitivity straight from that ripe spot in his chest, and the lyrics put this desperation on a profound pedestal to help him treat it. They heave love letters over to his mother dying from cancer in a stumbling mess, and the production connects electronic sequences with twinkling acoustics that would fit snugly in a child's bedroom as the backdrop to illustrated night skies and storybooks. These touches are the Cora harps on Plastic and Cora Sings, and the feathered pipes skedaddling off at the start of the latter as well. And the bearskin pianos on No One Knows Me Like the Piano and What Shouldn't I Be? But those cuts are more like performances for his family in their living room or dining room. He dreams back the basses he used to be able to come to daily and took for granted, and seeing his rocky heart palpitations in tracks like Blood on Me and Reverse Faults shows how valuable that serene equilibrium is. I mean, the latter is total paranoia. It's him feeling like everything's putting him on the spot, and his fight or flight response telling him to drive away. And this cut stops in its tracks in the hook, switches the drums, and has all the parts of the scene crash through the window. I'm talking car parts, body parts, broken glass, everywhere. And that takes me to the electronic parts. The oscillating swoops in this track and the vocal ringlets and under emit a reflective glow so faint they remind me of those heat signs in modern art museums. But Sampha's warm-blooded passion, same color as lava lamp juice, spills out all over every cut, and it's hard not to see that as its selling point. So yeah, that concludes part 1 of my decade list, and I'll see you in part 2 if you're interested, if you've gotten all the way to the end of this video.